Hey there, entrepreneur, and welcome to today's show. I am joined by Marianne Moore, who is an entrepreneur and strategy consultant specializing in human rights. She founded the social justice consultancy Justice Studio in 2011 and has worked extensively in the UK and in over 30 countries on criminal, child, and gender justice issues. She's essentially on a mission to delegitimize these structures and values of traditional business, helping the world to see that a new way is possible. So thank you so much for being with me here today, Marianne.
Thank you for having me here. It's very exciting to talk to you.
Yeah. So, before we jump in, and you and I talked about this a bit before, today's topic, folks, we're going to be talking a lot about, how do you run a business when it is steeped in, social issues or, hard things. And I made a joke with her earlier that it's not like she's selling t-shirts, but she still has to run a company that is built upon social justice consultancy. So I just wanted to give a little bit more context about Marianne so you understand what she's dealing with. This is a very micro, glimpse into it. But again, she's worked on prison and criminal justice reform in over 30 countries. Her clients are, companies like UNICEF, Council of Europe, foreign Commonwealth and development offices. She's provided high-level technical expertise to governments in Turkey, Macedonia, and Albania, leading and designing the first ever Child Rights Act of Somaliland. And other things like designing, delivering, and evaluating training for police, prison inspectors, judges, so many topics that aren't, again, we're not just selling a product here. So I wanted to just drive that home a little bit, because when folks are thinking about things like, oh, I need to do my bookkeeping, or, oh, I need to hire an employee, this is a little bit of that on steroids, right, Marianne? So just tell me, how you got to be doing work like this. Like, what was your journey to get here?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always been a very passionate person, and I think for a long time, quite passionate about human rights, gender justice, and then, although it wasn't called that in my day when it was
right.
kind of feminism, but also kind of children in the criminal justice system. I felt that they were really badly treated, and I had a kind of a lot of passion around these human rights issues. But I essentially started out as a consultant, as a management consultant, working for kind of big consultancies in the UK, which were focused on government support and supporting charities, and also worked in the international development consultancy space too, where you kind of send a consultant out to a country and get them to do something.
Right.
So I kind of had this weird thing whereby I was really obsessed about human rights, but I was applying it in a way that was in a consultancy lens. So through short projects, through strategic projects, through evaluating the work that other people have done.
Right.
And yeah, kind of doing that kind of stuff, which is not necessarily your traditional route into it. But it does kind of set you up nicely to establish your own consultancy company.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it teaches you the ropes of that part, essentially. But can you give a little bit more context to us around, when you're saying like child justice reform and things like that? You and I talked about this too, because I don't think people realize that there are other ways of doing things besides, this traditional model. So can you give a little bit of historical background around that piece in particular?
Yeah, of course. I think so. Children, I think, get a raw deal really in our society. I know that there's a lot of talk about children, being too full of themselves or whatever, sometimes with some people. But in general, children, and especially children who have a number of different vulnerabilities, are really often forgotten by our society, by the UK government, by the US government. They are often subject, if they're going into care, for example, to local authorities who are not necessarily looking after them, going into children's homes where they can be abused. Children in the criminal justice system can get sucked in because the age of criminal responsibility is very low. In the UK, it's the age of 10, and in the US, in some states, there isn't an age of criminal responsibility. Wow. And in many, it's kind of between 7 and 12. So it's, you can get very young children, very vulnerable children being sucked into the criminal justice system. And then once they're there, it's hard for them to get out. And so a lot of the work that I did in my early career and and what I'm very passionate about is trying to think of a different way of doing it. You know, a lot of the problems that lead children into criminal activity in the first place could be alleviated if we were looking after them properly when they were younger,
Right.
if we were supporting them in terms of their psychological well-being and making sure that they weren't being abused or neglected and all of this kind of stuff. So all of the issues very much interlink when you're thinking about how to better treat children in our society and not end up having them be our scapegoats for things.
Right. I mean, essentially, it's a very systemic, right, thing, right, or systematic rather, where it's very linear, and children aren't linear, and they don't understand, things like we tend to treat them like small adults, but they're really not. And there are so many developmental points along the way that if you stifle that development, that of course they're going to continue down that same path. So I think that's beautiful work that you do, and it just reminded me of some of the studies that have come out from Brené Brown. Just was talking about the link between humiliation and hurting people, right? And humiliation and violence and different things like that. And, that's the type of stuff that starts when we're children. And the fact that you're doing that work and have built a business around that and other things is quite commendable. But, in particular, take us beyond kind of what you've told us, like what inspired you to start your own thing? Like, where did you come from with that?
Yeah, I think so much. So I think both positive and negative experiences of my working life inspired me to set up my own consultancy. I would say that as I said, I'm very passionate about human rights. And I think in some of the workplaces that I was in, I felt a little bit like I was being put into a box, or kind of like I had to fit their working model, and I wasn't really allowed to really pursue my passions and kind of run off in the directions that I wanted to. And I had so much to offer that felt quite frustrating to me. Right. As well as just generally feeling that a lot of the big consultancy companies, although they have a great mission in terms of helping charities and governments to be more efficient and more effective, which I definitely support. I definitely think there can be a better way of operating for a lot of large organizations, but they didn't have the values. Many of the consultancies that I've worked for and that exist now today, they see the charitable and the government sector as just another market. It's just another place where you can earn money, rather than being more empathetic about, well, actually, what are these organizations trying to do and who are they trying to help? And there was that lack of compassion at the end, of the end service user, the end beneficiary, which felt really important, because what's the point in working to help an organization be better if you don't really share its values, or if you don't really care? And so what I wanted for my organization was that it could be a place in a lot of ways for a replacement almost, or a kind of alternative to what I'd experienced, so that we could create an organization which definitely did have the good values of consultancy. So we do help governments, we do help charities, we help them be more efficient. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but we also have like a heart and we care. And we want to help these organizations to improve the end results for beneficiaries and service users. And I think that it's that kind of added bit of heart as well as brain, which is important.
Yeah. I mean, and that must be a difficult place to be, right? Because it's business, right? You hear people say that a lot, right? Like it's one of my biggest pet peeves when people say take the personal out of business, right? But at the end of the day, so how do you draw that line as the person who actually owns the business, but the person who's involved in these organizations who are doing social justice work, which you're trying to optimize and make an impact with? So that is a very tricky line to walk, I imagine.
Very tricky. And I think it, in a way, your question comes down to the fact of, what do we see as business? And I think that there's this separation between business and like not-for-profit work or charity work, right? Which I think is in the minds of a lot of not-for-profit people too. But when I set out to establish Justice Studio, I had the option to set it up as a business or as a charitable or not-for-profit organization. And I went for a business model because I thought it was important for me that we earn our money, that we don't just try and kind of fundraise for things. We're providing a service and we should get paid for that service, and that money to will fuel the business. So the idea is that it should be sustainable, but just because we're a business, doesn't mean that we have to be bad or evil, or that needs to be wrong in any way. And I think what people struggle with sometimes, or what I think it's important to emphasize, is that business can be good. I think we have this very old-fashioned idea of business because it's been created, actually the history of business and the history of companies is actually very shady, because it comes from our colonial past, setting up companies to then go and colonize Caribbean islands, for example, setting up companies to colonize India. It is a bit of a shady past, and it has been built on a certain model, but it doesn't have to be. We can change that model, and we can change the ethics around business. So I think that's what I would say first. But also, yes, I completely get your point that when you are, you can have heart, but at the end of the day, you need to make the money work. You need to be able to have enough money to pay to staff, and you need to keep afloat. And so you can't just be thinking, oh, I really want to do this project, or I want to work on this even more than that I'm getting paid for, even though we tend to do that a little bit too much. But essentially we have to keep thinking that we're a business, we have to stay afloat, we have to make commercial decisions as well as making decisions from the heart as well.
Right. So, I mean, do you essentially operate from two different brains? I mean, it just feels that way. And I actually hear it a lot from service-based entrepreneurs too, right? They get into it because they want to help, they want to support, but then, well, how do we turn around and charge, or how do we, but I mean, my response to that has always been, the more money you make, the more people you serve. So, how, I don't know, as like the leader of it, how do you do both?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is hard. They can conflict, but this is, I guess, the essential principle about the double bottom line, or the triple bottom line, which people may have heard of, around having profit and purpose and planet, if it's triple, and really making sure that business isn't just about profit. I mean, I think it's boring in essence, really, to be just about profit. I think if you don't have a purpose, then really, what's the point? What's the point in doing it at all? I think that both are really important. And I guess it comes down to that thing of there is a bit of a tension. There can be a bit of a tension, especially, I think it might be a bit of a woman thing as well, about not kind of charging too much, or maybe underselling, or not thinking enough about the profit, but realizing that it's okay to make money. You can make money and you can still be good. They don't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive things. So kind of sometimes there may be a bit of an argument between the head and the heart at different points, but I don't think that I think it is possible, to combine them and to make decisions based on both factors. Try and do that, but
I mean, and I think that's the case, is that you try to do that, right? And they're going to be cut and dry things like, can we afford to pay payroll? Well, then that is a pretty straightforward problem, versus, have you ever run into a situation where there is an organization or something that you'd like to work with because there would be a grand impact, but they couldn't pay you? So what's the situation like that happening?
I mean, it happens a lot. And I think it's not necessarily that we don't know that they can't pay us. So we have in the past also done some pro bono work for people who genuinely couldn't afford to do pieces of work, could afford to do have us, sorry. But yes, I think there is always a choice. We have to think, what projects are being offered, or what we're applying for, and does that actually make sense financially? What I've seen particularly is an interesting and strange process, is because I founded it, and originally it was just me as a one-woman band. I've grown it gradually into a 10-person company, and the process of that means that I have to readjust the limits of what we're going for, and what may have kind of fed me and a couple of people salaries for a few months in the early days isn't going to feed the salaries of 10 people. And so it's kind of trying to get those clients that can pay larger fees, because and with longer projects, because actually we need that in order to be sustainable. So it's kind of been a bit of a gradual growing and learning what our own what we're going to let in and what we're going to say no to,
Right.
Depending on kind of where we're at the growth stage.
Right. And now, do you have kind of passion projects that run, underneath? Because I've seen a lot of groups that say, we'll take on these big clients in order to, like you said, do the pro bono work or do the work that's more research based, that may not directly tied to a bottom line. So do you operate in that realm too?
Well, luckily, most of the projects, whether they're big or they're small, are all pretty much passion projects, because they all tend to be in
True.
human rights. So
Yeah.
Even if it's a project on human trafficking, or if it's a project on criminal justice reform, it's not a case of changing the type of project. It's just more about changing maybe the type of client, the size of the project, the scope of the project. So luckily, in that sense, and in fact, I'm actually quite proud that, because I think I'm a bit I've been discerning in the past about what I'm interested in and what I'm not interested in. And my main thing is I want my staff to love the work that they do and love the projects and be passionate about the projects. And I think we're very lucky that we don't have any boring projects or any projects that we just have to do. Most of our projects are pretty interesting, I would say.
That's wonderful. And I mean, and I like the way that you put it as like, you can make an impact, but you may have to scale up or scale down on what that looks like. And I like the fact that you're saying like your staff is very passionate and motivated by all of this. But I can imagine some of the topics that you're dealing in are also, they take a toll. So, I mean, how do you, as a leader of a group of people, of staff who are at times dealing with these tough topics that can, I would assume, lead to burnout on some level, how do you lead people through that?
Yeah, and that's such an important point. I mean, to give some context, we're working with an organisation in the UK called the Mariannes, who are the principal crisis helpline for people who are feeling suicidal and or need some help from anybody, really, a stranger on a hotline. And we've been doing 2 projects with them, looking at the frequent callers to that service, as well as suicide in the construction industry. So this is kind of pretty difficult stuff. We also have other projects with children's charities around child sexual abuse. So these are difficult topics. And when you're doing interviews or doing research and you're doing projects around some of these things, there's the possibility of secondary trauma from that information that you receive as a researcher, and kind of how you deal with that and how we deal with that as an organization has been a really key thing for us to set up. So what we've got at the organization now is we have a part-time psychologist that's basically kind of around and on call if anybody needs her. We've also developed different peer support tools so that after people have a difficult interview, they can kind of just unload. And yeah, of course, I think that you can't really lead an organization unless you have compassion and empathy for what that feels like. The kinds of interviews that I ask my staff to do, the kinds of ones that I've done myself before, I've interviewed a lot of children in incredibly difficult situations, in street situations all across the world, and I know it's horrible sometimes to have to hear the stories, and I think if I didn't first of all care about them and about the end service user, and also think, okay, well, what do we need to put in place as safeguards so that they don't burn out and we don't create more problems than than we're trying to solve, then I think that would mean that we weren't doing our jobs, and it could be really problematic. So we take it really, really seriously.
Which is wonderful, because I think other people would take the opposite of like, let's numb out. We're gonna be robotic when we go in. We're gonna, all business. We're not gonna let it permeate. We're just going to kind of almost, put a stone face on or stonewall through it. But there's only so much of that you can do when you're a human, correct? Going through what you're doing.
Definitely. I mean, I'm very open. So I think that there's no problem with showing emotion at work. And I think that there's a bit of a problem that we have in terms of the current business model, where it's like, yeah, nobody shows emotion, everybody has to kind of put on this front, and
Right.
yet emotions that seem to be acceptable is anger, which actually is a very good thing. And I am an emotional person. I'm also a reasonable, rational person, but I'm also an emotional person, and it's really important for me to, I think, to role model showing emotion and showing that that's okay. And
Right.
and as you say, it's the type of work we're doing, but also it is stressful running a business. You know, and for example, if somebody, if staff members leave, sometimes I cry, and I don't feel like I should hide that, really. I think, you know, sometimes you need to, I tell my staff, and I tell the people that I work with, that you may see me showing emotion, but this is not something that you need to worry about, because I'm a grown-up and I can handle my emotion. You don't need to get a tissue, you don't need to tell me to stop, you just need to like let me cry, and I'll stop crying. But it's better for me to get the emotion out, and I encourage them to do the same, because I think it's when you're putting on that front, and when you're denying your emotions, and when you're trying to numb out, that's when things just slip out in terms of this like anger or kind of responses that you can't control in such a way. So yeah, I think it is hard, but we need to express it, that it's hard, and I think people can be grown-ups and handle that.
Yeah. I mean, and all I could think of when you were speaking about, you know, how you have the psychologist on staff and things like that was like, this is something that shouldn't be limited to just, you know, your type of work. Like those psychologists could easily be employed at different companies who are doing completely, you know, not as deep work with secondary trauma, right? Because there are so many instances where people are triggered on the daily. I think it's wonderful that you put that in place in your company. So how do you though personally deal with, you know, because that's multi-layered, because then you're holding space. You're not only holding space, you're holding space for your employees as employees, your employees as they're dealing with secondary trauma. And then, you know, the layers up, and then yourself as you're dealing with the blowback from all of those different things. So how are you personally dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, it is really challenging, I would say. And I remember, you know, thinking about the title of your amazing podcast, The Resilient Entrepreneur.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, yes, I'm resilient, but I feel almost like there needs to be a
different word,
a more strong word for
that.
What I've kind of had to go through and kind of bounce back from, because it is really hard. I think it's tricky because for a long time I was working on projects as well as managing the team, and sometimes their projects are in another country and the team is back in the UK, and kind of trying to manage all that, manage cash flow, manage staff, and manage the project, and manage all of the different subjects that are coming up from the project. It is really challenging, and it has been really challenging. And I think that sometimes, you know, because you need to, ultimately everybody looks to you to hold the space for them, and to make them feel calm. And there is a challenge for a leader when you will feel the stress, and you're almost a depository for everybody else's stress. And yes, you feel stress, but there's only a limit to how much you can really show your stress. And I think it can be a bit different from showing emotions sometimes. You know, you have to be you have to temper it, right? So yes, I agree that you should cry, but I'm not going to have a complete breakdown. Breakdown
right in the middle of a crisis when your staff is crying. You're not going to choose then to cry.
Exactly. You choose your moments, like when it's kind of safe. But yeah, I think there is a big pressure, and I don't know whether I've always managed it well, because I think certainly there's been times when I've just felt really, gosh, I mean, how on earth can I continue to be the person that is, you know, responsible for everything, as well as the depositor for the stress, and still work on these projects and do all of this stuff. I mean, usually getting a bit of rest will help. And I think for me, it's been about keeping an eye on my goal, which is setting up this sustainable organization, and then gradually bringing people in so that I can have a bit more of a breather in certain areas, and then it's not so much all on my shoulders. So kind of setting up a board, for example, was really good for me, because that meant that I had other people to talk to, other people sharing the load, having ideas. And I've just recently brought a managing director on board, and that's been a kind of interesting experience to hand over a lot of stuff, but that's kind of helped me to also start to take a step back and have less days in the office, and and be working less on the project. So I don't think I have a magic solution. I think it's just much more about, you know, what kind of journey can you take, and what's most important to you, and keeping an eye on why, you know, you did it in the first place, and that's kind of kept me going.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of, that why, right? You hear that a lot, right? The staying rooted in the why. And you hear a lot about, you know, nonprofits and for-profits with mission drift, right? So, I mean, how are the ways that you've been able to not succumb to mission drift, or not just take money for money's sake? Because I've seen a lot of nonprofits do that, right? Where, you know, if you do have to choose between the money and this, or closing your doors and helping, you know, you do run to the money sometimes. So how have you been able to kind of keep in alignment with your mission?
Well, there's a lot of work out there actually for these kind of you know, in our industry. So there is an awful lot of work. And although we could have decided to work in the private sector and to be delivering management consultancy to those clients, but it didn't really make sense. So the ultimate goal and the ultimate point of the organization is that we're helping the end beneficiary, the service user, to have a better life. And if there is no end beneficiary or service user, then there isn't really a point. So if there's an organization that is working for them, fine, we will work for them. But if they're not, then we don't. And I just think it comes down to what's the point of the organization. I feel a lot of the time that sometimes we do work for work's sake, and I wouldn't want to be in a position whereby we were just keeping going with Justice Studio just because we set it up, you know, because it exists. If there's no projects anymore, or if something happens and we can't make it work financially, then we end. But I don't see the point in just kind of saying yes to things that we said no to, because otherwise we're not really fulfilling our purpose. As you say, we're kind of, our mission is drifting, and then everything becomes confused, and is there really a point to that?
Right. I enjoy how you just said, like, you know, well, what's the point? Right. And I think a lot of people will say, well, they get scared, right? They get fearful with their organizations that, you know, especially once they get employees, I have to keep these people employed. I have to, you know, those responsibilities increase. But I mean, you're unfortunately in a sector where there's no shortage of work for you to do. But when it comes to the future of the organization, like, what are you seeing for the future?
Well, I think it's really what I would like. And I think as I said, we came from a one-woman band, so a lot of the projects we started doing were very small. And what I want is, because of all of the experience and the knowledge that we've amassed, I mean, we work in, as you said, like child justice, criminal justice, gender justice, we work in safeguarding, we're working in climate justice now. And what I want is for us to have a bit more of an influence on some of the direction of funding and where projects happen, rather than where we are at the moment, which is that we're a bit more reactive. We're a bit more kind of, you know, we come in, we evaluate a program, and then we think, oh, they shouldn't have spent their money on this. This has made things worse. I'd like us to be able to use the expertise that we've gained over the years so that we could really enhance our influence and make sure that the money is being spent on things that make sense.
Right. So start it a little further upstream, it sounds like. Exactly. Is that what you mean? Yeah. So you're not almost on some levels render yourselves obsolete because you're further upstream, right? Mm-hmm. You wouldn't have to come in if they had spent the money appropriately 4 steps ahead of that. Right. Yeah. So if you can come in quicker and people can recognize the value quicker, you know, you would have a much better chance of influencing the situation, right?
Yeah, and also supporting them to do it in a different way, to one that they
Right.
hadn't necessarily thought about. I think that so many things are done because they've always been done, and
Exactly.
that doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So yeah, I think, yeah, moving further up the food chain and having a bit more influence and being able to therefore have that bigger impact. So as you say, you know, the more work you do, you know, the more money you make, more kind of influence or impact you have. And I think the higher up the chain we can go, and the more that the people who make the decisions about the funding and what happens or doesn't happen listen to us, then I feel that we will be achieving our mission a bit better.
Yeah. And I mean, what happens, or what are your thoughts around, you know, the discomfort that comes with disrupting? Because I can imagine, because you've already stated, you know, you hit the nail on the head where you said, like, we do things the way that we do them because they've always been done this way, right? But when you're shining a light on a possibility of a new way to do it, or a way that maybe was previously done that people have ignored, you know, how do you deal with that blowback or that, you know, discomfort of others, let's say, that may come back at you?
Yeah. I mean, I have no problem disrupting. I'm absolutely fine with disrupting.
I love it.
I quite enjoy it. And I actually think, I mean, that was part of the point of Justice Studio, right? To set up.
Right.
And that's the point, I think, of entrepreneurs. You know, you show people how things can be. Most people will join an organization and they'll have a job because they think that these are the things that they need to choose from. But an entrepreneur will go, hold on, I don't like that model, I want to do a different model. And so they set it up, and then they show the world an alternative way of being, an alternative way of working, an alternative culture, alternative values, an alternative purpose. So I almost think it's like our mission to do that. We need to be creative and allow our creativity to show other people who can't see how different it could be.
Right. And what about the people who don't believe you?
You show them.
Yeah. Thank you. I was going to say, I was like, because there's a lot of that when people say, well, they're not listening. And I was like, well, then don't worry if they're not listening.
Yeah.
Just go and show them. And then they will probably have to listen. Right.
Exactly. And that's the thing. And there are a lot of skeptics, of course, but you know, right. I think they can be a real drain. So I think it's about not spending too much time on naysayers, and just, you know, if you've got an idea, then go about, you know, working out how you do it and start doing it, because, you know, it's important. Other, you know, business was started by people or a long time ago, and with different values in a different world, and we need to show people how it can be done differently.
Right. Or else, you know, it's kind of the evolve or die kind of mentality, right? Like where you have to be innovating. I think it's my lovely friend Amy Jo Martins has innovation allergies, right? Like people just will not, they don't want to go near it, they don't want to touch it, they don't, you know, they don't want to look and see anything different about it, you know. But I imagine you come in and you shine a light on something in a way that's respecting maybe what they did, or maybe not, depending on what the situation calls for. But, you know, and then just shining a light on how they can be better as people, as organizations, as all of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, like, I wouldn't say that we've got it all perfect and that it isn't hard, and we don't make mistakes. And equally, I would say, you know, that I'm somebody that doesn't like innovation for innovation's sake. I don't like the idea of just like constantly reinventing the wheel, because we need to be seen as innovative, and that word is used so much as well. I think it's more about thinking about what are we trying to achieve, and not being constrained by different ways of trying to achieve that end goal. And not feeling like, oh, we want to achieve this, and so we have to do it the same way that it's always been. I think allowing ourselves to have a different model and to kind of reconstruct the values is really important, because the people who were in power when a lot of structures were set up didn't necessarily serve us. And as we and particularly women, I think, get more positions of being able to set up companies and having more responsibility and having that power to set up structures, we don't need to do it in the way that the men did. We can do it in a different way. That's okay.
Yeah. And I think exactly kind of what you're exemplifying here from a management perspective and from a leadership perspective is, you know, I can only think of so many times when I've cried in an office and been, you know, God forbid that ever happened and you felt like such a failure as a woman when that happened. But at the same time, somebody else, you can also give them permission when you're in a leadership position to feel that way and to have those vulnerable moments and know that it's a safe container to do so in, which I imagine you also set up when you interview people. So it's kind of a similar container space, right?
Yeah, I think it's really important to be clear with people when you interview them, and to think about how, to try and reflect the organization as well as possible when you're interviewing, so that people get the right sense of who you are. Right. And also to look for, I would say I look for emotional intelligence as much as I would look for intelligence. The people that work for me are intelligent, and I need them to be intelligent, but right. Also emotionally intelligent. And that was the key thing I was looking for when I appointed the managing director, is, does she have that emotional, does she have the empathy, does she have the reflectiveness, can she hold the space for people, can she reflect our values? These things were key, and these things are sometimes the more difficult things to find especially when you're recruiting for very senior posts. So yeah, I think definitely finding people who share those same values and aren't going to be scared about doing things slightly differently is key. And right. It doesn't always work out. Sometimes people very quickly, and generally in Justice Studio, we tend to realize quite quickly it's not the right match for them or us, because of various different reasons. But I think it's important to work that out quickly. But the people that do get it, I think, thrive in that environment. Right. So
right, and they thrive. I mean, there's a certain, like I started off saying when I was reading all of your amazing credentials, is that there is a certain type of personality, there is a certain type of person I can imagine that is aligned with this work for a reason. And some, like you tell me, some people come in, like you just said, thinking they can do it and they just can't do it, right? They don't, or they burn out, or like, how does that work? How have you seen that come to fruition?
I think it probably would be burnout in terms of, both the kind of, consultancies are very, it's quite a skilled job, and it's also quite an intense job anyway, because right. You're not just working on a multitude of projects. Yes. Yep. With all different timelines in all different subjects. So it's a lot to manage, and it keeps you very interested, like keeps your brain working, and it certainly doesn't get boring. But yeah, that can be a lot. And then especially with the different subject matter as well, and being a small organization, so we've never had investment, so we've grown because we've first had to do the work of more people than we have. I had to do the work of 2 people to get another person in, and we had to do the work of 3 people to get another person in. And so it's that especially in a period of growth is hard on staff. And I've certainly seen that it can be too much for people. But I think in general, they're all so committed to the subjects that we're working in, and each has their own different particular interest. Maybe it's more gender, maybe it's more criminal justice, but everybody is really passionate about the kinds of projects that we do. Interestingly, when you say about personality types, we kind of do those Myers-Briggs things, and often we all fall into the same kind of general pool of kind of these diplomat people who are kind of really passionate about purpose, but tend to overwork. It's quite funny.
I think society relies on those people on a lot of levels. So thank you. I'm thanking you, but I'm probably in there too. So do you have any kind of last tidbits of advice for anyone leading like a really deeply mission-driven business, right? Because like you said, it's kind of a unicorn in itself, where, like you mentioned, one day you're dealing with the numbers, the next day you're interviewing a person, there's a lot of skill sets required. So any last tidbits that you could leave with the audience?
Yeah, I think that the key thing, well, I've learned a lot about leadership and about how to be a compassionate but also strong and steadfast and authoritative leader. Mm-hmm. I'm empathetic and I have a softness to me, but at the same time I also sometimes have to make very difficult decisions about maybe letting people go or different things like that. But I think that's the most horrible decision that you have to make.
Agreed.
is that kind of decision. And I think it's important for all leaders and all entrepreneurs to kind of go on that journey and kind of work out how can they have the softness and the hardness at the same time, and to not feel that you can't be soft, or not feel that you can't be hard. If that makes sense. You kind of need to get a balance between both, and that's going to work for everybody in a slightly different way. But having those boundaries of also yourself and your own inner, what you are prepared to put up with and not put up with, I think has been really important for me to learn, especially as a woman. I keep saying that, but I think we're conditioned very much to be pleasing and to kind of do things for other people. And so making sure that I have my boundaries in place has been really important to me, as well as in terms of having that balance between the soft and the hardness. But for me, it always boils down to the fact that in the position of leadership and as an entrepreneur, if you set up an organization, ultimately you have to do what's best for the organization and ensure that that survives, and until it's no longer necessary for it to survive, or until it doesn't, or achieves, or the mission is irrelevant anymore at a certain point. So I think it's really about thinking about that end goal and what do I need to do for the business, but having in the long term and having that kind of overview and that long term thinking, so that you can make sometimes difficult short-term decisions in service to what you want the future of the organization to be.
Right. I mean, like you said, like your headlights, right? They extend further out than somebody who's maybe a newbie in the organization, right? Like your vision, your ability to see, and your decision-making capability extends out with that, a little further out than, someone at an entry-level position would. And I enjoy the fact that you're saying that you don't have to be hard and soft. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think you do have to have somewhat of a high level of self-awareness to be able to understand what your boundaries are, and also understand what you bring to the table, for good, bad, ugly, whatever it may be, and understand when you're triggered as a leader in a negative way, so that you're not, the blowback isn't going to your employees, which I think is a very, again, I hate to say it, very masculine way of doing it, where they get yelled at, shit rolls downhill, they yell at somebody else, right? So, which doesn't really usually work very well.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's that thing of stress as well. It's that fact of knowing that as the leader, or as the person that set it up, your stress travels much further than other people's stress. Exactly. And so you need to learn when you're stressed and what you do when you're stressed. And if that tends to be to then pass it on to somebody else through shouting at them, then you're going to need to work on that. And I think you're exactly right. Like, self-awareness is so important. And I look for that when I employ people, and I try and constantly work on that myself. I think over the years, as I said, I've learned so much through the different people I've managed, the different projects I've done, the different way I've been trying to juggle things, when I've made mistakes and when I've hopefully got it right. And just knowing that you're this constantly evolving being, which that needs to learn and will change in different situations is really important. Certainly it's been interesting as well, handing my baby over to this managing director, and kind of me learning the psychological impact of that. It's felt kind of existentially challenging in a way to have responsibility, but no longer really day-to-day control of the organization. And I knew it would be hard, but I didn't quite know how deeply it would kind of
it permeates
from me. Yeah, exactly. Permeates through. And so that's been my current challenge. I mean, you always get challenges. You think you think you're good, and no. It's like, oh, there's another challenge. So yeah, this has been my most recent challenge, is how can I need to still hold the space, and I need to give her a chance to kind of take the organization forward. And I know it's the right thing for the organization and for myself, that I kind of gradually step back, because I want it to be sustainable. But yeah, psychologically that is hard, and I need to be aware of making sure that I don't trigger anybody or trigger myself, or kind of unduly upset that process as well.
Yeah. And I mean, and keeping your own expectations in check too, because you are human, right? Because that is such a hard thing. And I was reading something about how, that there should be like a course or a something for when, especially around CEOs who, sell an exit, like an exit strategy, like psychologist, right? Who works with that person, especially, like you said, it is your baby. And that is another intersection of where nonprofit and for-profit comes in play. Because I see it a lot in founders, like founder syndrome and things like that, where they don't want to let it go. But I applaud you for saying it's for the best of the organization that I do release, but maybe I may kick and scream a little bit on the way. And that's okay too, because you've worked really hard on it.
Yeah, and I can completely understand why founders would start going down the road and then backtrack and be like, actually, no, I'm going to stay in charge. Like I've had all of those kind of feelings. And I think if I wasn't working on myself and reflecting on myself and thinking, no, hold on, what do you really want? What's my life purpose? Right. What's Justice Studio's life purpose? I mean, it's time for us to part and let the child go to university or whatever it is. It is hard, and I can see why people wouldn't want to go through that process. But I think when it is the right decision for you, riding out those emotions is important, and kind of letting them come, riding
waves, riding the wave, right? Instead of letting it completely capsize your boat, right? And I think what I love hearing when you're talking is the fact that you're saying, like, you're open to learning, you're open to feeling, you're just open. Which I think sometimes folks, when they're running companies, think they've arrived and then it stops, right? And I don't think it ever stops, ever, as humans or as leaders or as entrepreneurs, right?
No, it doesn't. It really doesn't. There's always a new challenge. And there is this kind of nice idea of maybe sitting in a corner office and putting your feet up, right, staring at the lovely view. But no, it really isn't. And I think that's probably what everybody finds. They kind of think, oh yeah, this is great, I'm kind of the boss now or whatever. But actually being the boss is very hard.
Yeah,
and there's
it's different. It's a different set of challenges. Don't underestimate it, folks. You don't, it's kind of be careful what you wish for. And it's not that you don't want to continue to wish for big things, but just be aware of what it's going to require of you, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I've certainly felt that at different points, a big eye opener of, oh, okay, wow, right. Okay.
Well, I mean, that's wonderful. Well, tell people where they can find you. I'm going to link to, your company, to you, all that good stuff in the notes, but tell people anyway where they can get you.
Great. Well, we have our website, justicestudio.org, and we have our Twitter, which is @JusticeStudio. We have our Instagram, which is @JusticeStudio. We're on Facebook and we're on LinkedIn. And then I personally am @CreatrixLondon on Instagram, and I'm also on LinkedIn. And it would be great I'd be love to talk to anybody really about it. I find it really fascinating. But that's how you can reach us. And so please do.
Then I have to say, you put up very interesting videos on Instagram. I enjoy them because you teach a lot of interesting things about our history and about things that maybe you wouldn't think of, that are very enlightening. So thank you for putting those out. And, thank you very much for enlightening our leaders today on the show too.
Thank you. It's been really fun to talk to you. And it's been great. Thanks.